Salve, pessoal. Boa noite. Vamos hoje assistir essa palestra desse professor americano, especialista em TDAH, né? Vai ajudar aí muita gente que sofre, né, com o problema ou que tem filhos pequenos. No meu caso é meu filho pequeno. Estou estudando muito sobre essa questão, né, para poder entender melhor, compreender melhor como é que ele se comporta, por que ele se comporta dessa maneira, né? E o Dr. Russell Beckley é o maior especialista em TDAH do mundo, né? Obviamente dos Estados Unidos, né? Só para variar. Tá bom? Vamos lá, vamos ver essa palestra aí, tá? Valeu. Eu diminuí a velocidade para
When Heidi asked
0,75
me to come up
para a gente poder
to
acompanhar melhor a
speak to
tradução,
you,
tá bom?
an invitation, by the way, for which I'm grateful and honored. I thought, what am I going to say to what is largely, I believe, a group of parents and loved ones of people with ADHD? And so she wanted me to do something a little new and a little different. And I sat down and I said, what ideas would I want any family that we had seen in our clinic to understand by the time we had finished working with that family, by the time we'd finished the evaluation and the counseling of that family, what would be the 30 take-home ideas? I tried to reduce it to 10, by the way, but that's just not possible. And 30 was even a bit of a struggle. There's another 30 I left out. But I think of these as sort of the touchstone ideas that a family needs to understand if they really are going to appreciate both the nature of this disorder in a child and what it means for the raising and management of that child successfully. So we're going to have some fun with this because I've not done this presentation in this way ever before, and you may advise me never to do it again. So we'll see. Obviously, the first idea is to know the disorder, and we begin at a very elementary stage of this disorder. This is a developmental disability. That is the first thing you need to understand. A disability of what? There are two psychological traits that are not developing in this child on time. So let's clarify that. A developmental disability means that you are showing age-inappropriate behavior. It doesn't mean that your behavior is pathological. It just means it's not appropriate for your age. So understand one thing. ADHD is different from normal in a quantitative way, not a qualitative way. Developmental disorders differ from psychopathologies. A psychopathology is a gross aberration in your behavior that we can recognize at any age. If you are bipolar, if you are schizophrenic, if you have major depression, we don't need to adjust the criteria for your age because those are grossly abnormal conditions. Autism would be another one. Those are not developmental disabilities. A developmental disability is a delay in the rate of a normal trait. What distinguishes this child from other children who don't have the disorder is the degree of the delay. They will go through the same stages that others would go through in normal development, but not at the same time. And when these traits reach their ultimate maturity, which, by the way, is your early 30s, The person with ADHD will be leveling off at a degree well behind that of where the general population has leveled off in that trait. So delay does not mean lag. It doesn't mean temporary. This is a chronic lag in the development of these traits. But the important thing is that the difference between this child and other children is quantitative. It is like someone sitting next to you who is shorter or taller. It is like someone who is more athletic or less athletic. These are not qualitative differences, they're quantitative. So that is what separates your child from others. The degree of the delay is the distinction. I say this because so many trade books written for parents have argued that ADHD is a qualitatively different human. Your child is a little hunter, and he has to go to school with farmers. Your child has a gift that other children do not have. This is nonsense. This is utter gibberish. There never was nor will be any science that would support those ideas. ADHD is not a qualitative different state of humanity from other people. It is much more like being better or worse at writing, taller or shorter in your height, better or worse at language. Those are quantitative differences. That's important because otherwise we stigmatize these people as coming from a different planet. You know, one is from Venus, another from Mars, to popularize or to take up a popular view of gender differences between men and women. But you get the point. People with ADHD are not different from normal other than in the degree of the delay. Now, what is it that is delayed? Two traits. The first is not the one after which the disorder is named. In that sense, the disorder has been misnamed. The first deficit to appear is inhibition, a failure to develop appropriate inhibition of your behavior. And this will often emerge in the preschool years. And its first sign is usually hyperactivity, though it doesn't need to be so. But it typically is. You have an individual who is behaving too much, who is not suppressing irrelevant behavior the way other children are able to do. We will see this in their motor actions. There's a lot of action coming out of this child. We will see it in their verbal behavior. There's a lot of words coming out of this individual. And we will see it in their intrusive and disruptive motor and verbal behavior as well. But along with that, there is a cognitive impulsiveness, this snap decision-making, this quickness to do the first thing that pops into your head without due delay and due diligence, thinking about what the consequences will be. And then we will also see the restlessness, not just the gross motor activity, but the seat restlessness, which I think affects their school performance more than the gross motor activity does. But this will decline with age. So that is why hyperactivity is no longer the name of this disorder, because it declines steeply. And by adolescence, it's nearly gone. And by adulthood, it's an internal state. It's a feeling inwardly of a need to be busy and doing multiple things. And it's a busyness of one's mind, one's ideas. There is a restless quality to their cognition. but not to their outward behavior. In fact, our research has shown that hyperactivity is of no diagnostic value in adulthood. In fact, being restless is more associated with anxiety disorders by the time you're 30 than it is being associated with ADHD. We just don't pay attention to it. It's of no relevance to diagnosis. So let's understand that the real problem here is not restlessness. It is, in fact, inhibition. There is a failure to develop appropriate inhibition, and it affects your behavior, it affects your words, it affects your mind and your thoughts. And we need to return to the idea which we have gotten rid of, that it affects your emotions. For the first 170 years of the history of ADHD in the medical literature, which began in 1798, not 1902, 8 years ago, the last remaining copy of a medical textbook was discovered at Kent State University. This textbook was written by the Scottish physician, then living in colonial America, Alexander Crichton. And Crichton had written a medical textbook in which there is a chapter entitled Diseases of Attention. And it is the first description of this disorder. And it's very good, by the way. So ADHD did not begin in 1902. It started in 1798 as far as the first initial medical reference. And from that point on until 1976, emotion was part of ADHD. Every major theorist, every paper, every science paper, including that of Mark Stewart, one of the first major scientific descriptions, the Canadian papers by Weiss and Heckman and Wary and Douglas and others back in the 60s and 70s, all included emotional impulsiveness as part of this disorder. But the DSM parsed it aside and made it an associated problem in some people. It isn't. It is as much a core feature of this disorder as is any other symptom in the DSM. And that was our mistake. And it needs to be returned to our understanding of ADHD. By emotional impulsiveness, I mean this quickness to anger, to be easily excitable, to have low frustration tolerance, to be easily angered by things around you, and to display your emotions much more quickly than other people do. Now, this is not a mood disorder, even though it starts to look like one. Mood disorders are where you are generating too much emotion. What ADHD is a failure to regulate normal emotion. It is a self-regulation disorder. The feeling you're...
Pessoal, pegaram aí essa parte? Essa parte é fundamental. TDAH, essencialmente, é um transtorno que te impede ou dificulta, né, a regulação da tua emoção, né? Dificulta a regulação da emoção. Fantástico, é isso mesmo. É o que eu sinto.
You're having is normal, that you are not moderating it is not. It is this inability to self-soothe, to self-calm and to then moderate the emotion to be more acceptable for the context and for what you hope to accomplish here, the goal that is at hand. Your long-term welfare is at stake. Can you modify that emotion to be more socially acceptable, to be less costly, less damaging? That is as much a part of ADHD as anything else. And we are pushing the DSM-5 committees, there are several, to reincorporate emotional impulsiveness and this emotional dysregulation as being a part of this disorder, because it loads on this dimension. You cannot be impulsive in your behavior and not be impulsive in your emotions. That is impossible because they are a unity. They go together. Emotion is welded to everything you say and do. Sometimes it is benign and bland. Other times it is powerful and intense. It is the emotional coloring of the behavior we display. If you are impulsive in one, you must be in the other. That needs to get reintroduced back into ADHD for a number of compelling reasons, not just because historically it was always there, but because it explains so much more than the current view of ADHD explains. As I will show you, ADHD children are 11 times more likely to develop oppositional defiant disorder within 2 years of the onset of their ADHD. Why? What do those disorders have to do with each other? Now they're treated as simply comorbidity. Oh, well, they go together, but we're not sure. But if you put emotion back into ADHD, you see the connection right into ODD, because everybody with ADHD is automatically subclinically ODD at the get-go. It's only going to take one more symptom to cross the diagnostic threshold. In other words, ADHD causes ODD. That is an important thing to understand, because the ODD, while it does have some social influences over it, half of ODD is the inability to manage frustration, impatience, and anger. And that will set you up for the second component of ODD, which is interaction conflict, defiance, arguing. But the first 4 symptoms of the 8 in ODD are mood, anger, temper, hostility, easily annoyed, irritability. And that is part of ADHD. So we need DSM-5, and we need families to both understand that emotion goes with this disorder. It is not a separate comorbidity in some cases. And now we know why when we treat ADHD, particularly with the medications that we use, we get nearly as much reduction in ODD as we get in ADHD. And when we don't, it is because of the social conflict component, which is learned. And we will have to unlearn that little piece. But the mood component is the ADHD component. Now, by returning emotion into ADHD, it also helps families to understand some of the other life course risks. 50 to 70% of ADHD children are utterly rejected by close friendships by 2nd grade. It is, in fact, one of the more devastating consequences of this disorder.
Pessoal, essa parte é fundamental. Vou até voltar aqui, porque ela é a aplicação na vida das pessoas, né? Na vida real das pessoas. E o meu filho de 7 anos já está passando por isso. Eu percebo que ele tem poucos amiguinhos na sala de aula, sabe? E é por isso. Ó.
Both understand that emotion goes with this disorder. It is not a separate comorbidity in some cases. And now we know why when we treat ADHD, particularly with the medications that we use, we get nearly as much reduction in ODD as we get in ADHD. And when we don't, it is because of the social conflict component, which is learned. And we will have to unlearn that little piece. But the mood component is the ADHD component. Now, by returning emotion into ADHD, it also helps families to understand some of the other life course risks. 50 to 70% of ADHD children are utterly rejected by close friendships by second grade. It is, in fact, one of the more devastating consequences of this disorder is this inability to make and keep close, sustained friendships with other children. And it is heartbreaking for parents to see this happening, that their child is not as liked as other children, that the sleepovers, the going to the movies, and the other social events in which other children celebrate their peer relationships are shut off for this child. Why is it there? The single best predictor of peer rejection is that symptom, the emotional impulsiveness. Friends forgive you your distractibility, your forgetfulness, your working memory problems, and even your restlessness. They will not forgive your anger, your hostility, the quickness with which you emote to other people, because it is offensive. It is socially costly. So now we can begin to understand the numerous social problems that ADHD children are prone to, because it arises from this aspect of the inhibitory deficit. There are other things that it explains. I could do a whole hour and a half, as I did a month ago in Toronto, on the importance of emotion in ADHD. I won't go there. But suffice to say that it explains the road rage during driving, the job dismissals, which are not the result of inattentiveness, but of being too quick to anger, too quick to express raw emotion in the workplace, of which employers are not tolerant, especially if it occurs with a customer. And it also explains to us the marital difficulties and the parenting difficulties these children may be prone to, because the single best predictor of marital problems in the adult with ADHD is not distractibility, it is emotion. So we can begin to paint a better picture of understanding ADHD and its life course risks by understanding the nature of the inhibitory problem, and that it includes emotion as part of it. And that's just slide one. I've got 85 slides. Do you see why I'm concerned? 15 minutes to do a slide. All right, so we better get rolling here. But I thought you ought to know where we're going. And by the way, in case you hadn't noticed, I will not talk down to you today. I will treat you as if you were my colleagues, my students, my peers, because I think that parents attend these things to learn, and that's not going to happen if I have to dumb this material down, and it is also insulting. and I won't insult your intelligence either. You're knowledgeable people. I'll speak to you frankly using the scientific terminology. Oh, please.
Helen Hadsell was able to win any competition she took part in. She was known as the contest queen because she
The second dimension, failing to develop on schedule, will appear about 2 to 3 years after the first. And this is known as the attention deficit, but it isn't. Here again, we have a misnomer. There are at least 6 or 7 kinds of attention and supporting networks in the human brain. They are not all disrupted by this disorder. What we want to know is which one. To help us with differential diagnosis, to help us tell ADHD from an anxiety disorder and from autism, and all the other psychiatric disorders, which all interfere with attention at some point in life, ADHD is not the only attention deficit. We need to be more precise. If someone comes to us and says, my child or I am inattentive, that is useless diagnostically. What I need to know is the nature of the inattentiveness. And we have now known for a decade that the inattentiveness that we see in ADHD is distinct from that produced by all other disorders, because it is most, I think, accurately described as a failure of persistence. The first attention problem is persistence toward a goal. Notice that this implies behavior, motivation, and the future. That is very important. The other forms of attention do not. ADHD is not a problem of perception, of filtering, of processing, of how the posterior part of our brain functions. It is a problem with the motor part of the brain, this frontal lobe. Can you sustain action toward a goal adequately to attain it? That implies a motivation deficit, and that is true. And it implies future-directed behavior, and that is true. ADHD is a failure to direct behavior forward in time. We cannot persist toward these delayed endpoints in life, the tasks, the goals, the things that need to get done. So persistence is deficit 1 in the area of attention. Now, to persist toward a goal, you must be able to resist distractions. But that too is not a perceptual issue. It is a motor issue. The person with ADHD does not have problems with perceiving distractors better than others. It is that they respond to distractors more than others. And that is an inhibitory failure, not a perceptual difference. You and I may all hear the noise in the kitchen. The person with ADHD is compelled to react to it. Oh, did you hear that? I guess they're washing dishes. Maybe I'll stop in and take a look. Did you know I was a dishwasher when I was back in college? That's how I earn my way. Do you see what's going on here? You all heard the dish, but it was irrelevant to what we're here to do today. But to the ADHD individual, the distraction is going to provoke a response, and the response can't be inhibited. And now they're off to the races, skipping from one thing to another to another. Now, there is a third aspect here that is impaired, but it is not one of attention. Most people, when they are distracted, re-engage the incompleted goal. The person with ADHD is far less likely to do so. And this has nothing to do with attention. This is working memory. So I would want a family to understand that there's more here than inattentiveness. There is a working memory disorder. And I would want them to know that working memory is one of the 5 special executive functions of the human brain, suggesting that ADHD is EFDD, executive function deficit disorder. Because working memory is where we remember what we're doing. It is remembering so as to do. It is consciously, effortfully holding in mind the what, the when of what we are doing. It's what you lose at my age and when you hit menopause. You do not lose memory. You lose working memory. You forget what you were doing, where you were going, what the goal was, the steps to the goal, how you were getting there. It is that that allows you to re-engage the incompleted goal because you are holding in mind the goal. It is that which ADHD children and adults will lose. The goal is gone. It is forgotten. And now anything else compelling around them will capture their behavior. Hence, the symptom skips from one incompleted activity to another. The ability to re-engage a goal is a working memory disorder. And that's what they cannot do. And this begins to open the door on the possibility that the other 4 executive functions are impaired as well. More on that later. So let's understand that there are 3 interacting attentional problems, but that they are best thought of as executive deficits, not attention deficits. And they are the problem with persistence toward the future, resistance of distractions along the way, and working memory. And now you understand the nature of this attention problem from the one that's produced by anxiety and depression and autism and all the other disorders, including the learning disabilities, which have nothing to do with these. I would want families to understand that there is more to ADHD than just the inhibition and these attention and working memory problems. That at its heart, in its soul, it is a disorder of self-regulation, not one of attention. I think the biggest problem we have had as a group in convincing the general public about the seriousness of our children's disorder versus autism or schizophrenia or the other disorders is the very name itself is trivial. ADHD. Go to Starbucks. Good God. Have some caffeine. We got more serious fish to fry here in psychiatry than the fact that you just can't pay attention, right? Part of the reason that our disorder, that the name of this disorder is so often pilloried in the media is because I think we misnamed it. This is a developmental disorder of self-regulation, not of attention. And that is a serious disorder, as serious as manic depression, and in its own way, as autism. But it doesn't convey that to people if they understand it only as ADHD, as opposed to SRDD, a self-regulatory developmental disorder. So I would want families to understand the seriousness of this, that this isn't simply inattention. There are some profoundly unique human traits that are not emerging as they should in this individual. And if you'll understand that, you'll understand the bigger picture, the why of everything. If it's just an attention problem, why am I seeing impairments in virtually every domain in which this child is asked to function? That would not come from just inattentiveness, but it would come from an executive function disorder, a self-regulatory disorder. So I would want parents to understand that this is the essence of this disorder, self-regulation. What is that? It is, first of all, the ability to consciously, willfully choose to inhibit your behavior and then to engage in a series of self-directed actions. That is, after all, what self-control is. You start to do things to yourself. These are responses that are not directed at the world around you. They're directed at you, right? You're trying to change your behavior in some fundamental way. The second part of self-control that your child struggles is not just the stopping, but the thinking. The thinking is the self-directed activity, the stuff I am doing to myself. Why would I do these things to myself? To change my behavior from what it would otherwise be. And why would I do that? To change my future. Self-regulation is not just for short-term self-improvement. It's for long-term self-improvement. It's to see to your own welfare over the long term. Should you act this way, given the sustained or delayed consequences that lie ahead for you? That is what you must stop and think about. And that is what they don't stop and think about, the delayed consequences. So your child is not just inattentive, they cannot stop and engage in a series of self-directed actions that they will now use to modify and moderate their behavior so as to bring it in line with their long-term welfare, the future. And that's what your child is struggling so mightily with in their development. It's what the other kids are acquiring, and your child is so far behind in.
Eu gravei um curso gratuito de inteligência artificial. Na verdade, um mini curso, direto e reto, em que eu te ensino.
Então, minha gente, é isso aí. O pessoal tá raspando, né? Superficialmente a questão do problema. Ah, desatenção, desatenção. Não é só isso, né? É um espectro. E nesse espectro há diversos vertentes, né? E por isso que eu acho esse vídeo fantástico, fundamental.
I would want parents to understand something that the vast majority of the lay population does not understand. Self-control is not learned. It is not the result of your upbringing and how good your parents were. This is one of the most profound insights from our research on ADHD. ADHD, as we will see, is largely a neurogenetic disorder. But then let's pursue the implication. If that is true and ADHD is a self-regulation disorder, then self-control is largely neurogenetic in origin. That has a philosophically profound conclusion. The vast majority of variation in the people sitting in this room and their ability to manage their behavior is not from how they were raised. It is a part of who they are. It is a part of their neurogenetic gifts. And that is very stunning indeed. That our capacity for regulating ourselves is a neurobiological trait, not some socially learned phenomena that you just happen to pick up from your parents. So I would want them to know that ADHD, being a self-regulation disorder, is arising out of neurogenetic causes, and that this inability to direct behavior toward yourself comes from impairments in the following 5 executive abilities. And these have to do with brain development, not with training. It does not mean that training cannot enhance them. It means that they don't originate at the beginning in training, in the social environment. The social environment requires that they be there already, and then it will help to shape them to become more proficient. Think of your language ability. You didn't learn language, but it doesn't mean that you can't become more proficient in how you speak and how you write. But speaking and writing are not accounted for on the basis merely of training by your parents. You're going to develop a language no matter where you grow up. That is a neurobiological trait, and it unfolds as the brain unfolds. It is an instinct, and so is self-control. But self-control can be reduced to these 5 things. What are the 5 things you do to yourself? These are the things your child struggles to do. Number 1, can you stop? Can you wait? Because as Rabelais said in the novel Gargantua, which most of you have never read, I'm sure, but it is where this phrase comes from. Everything comes to those who can wait. The waiting is the tough part. You must build in a pause between the event and what you plan to do about it. And in ADHD, there is no pause. The event happens and your response is up, out, done. It is as if there was no front part to the brain. It is as if you were like any other species with a spinal cord. Event, response, event, response. Or as in a Gary Larson cartoon, remember The Far Side? 2 amoebas, a husband and wife, talking to each other. One amoeba, the wife, of course, says to her husband, stimulus, response, stimulus, response. Don't you ever think? Characterizes ADHD right there. Right? Don't you ever think? Once you stop, you will engage in 4 subsequent actions. The first is mental imagery. You will recall the past and you will play a DVD of it in your head. You have a theater in your mind. It is your visual imagery system, the mind's eye. So your child not only cannot stop, they cannot visualize as well as other children. And what they do not visualize before they act is the past, the relevant past. Do you have experiences in this situation previously? If so, what would they have told you to do? Lay people call this hindsight, and the word sight is no coincidence. You are visually imagining your history. What does it have to say? And you lack hindsight. Now, this will lead to foresight. You look back to anticipate. What does ADHD lead to? No foresight. You are not thinking ahead because you weren't looking back either. Hindsight and foresight are the opposite sides of the same coin. Visual imagery. So you will not use your images of your past to tell you what to do. You will just do. And then by 5 years of age, you will get the third executive deficit. You can't talk to yourself. Young children by 5 years of age are beginning to internalize their speech and use it on themselves. Just watch any first and second grade classroom and you will see this. If you have a 3 to 5 year old, you'll hear it. They're talking to themselves out loud most of the day, whether anyone is in the room or not. Listen to bedtime and you will hear what I mean. But over the next 10 years, this external voice gets directed to themselves and slowly made private and mental in its form. And so originates the voice in your head. And that voice in your head is there for one very important reason. It's to help control yourself. You start telling yourself what to do, and it starts to work. And now any family I would explain this to would understand that not only can your child not stop, not only do they not have the mind's eye, they don't have the mind's voice. And what is there is very weak. It's not controlling them. So now you know why they can't do what you tell them to do. They can't follow instructions, they can't follow rules, they can't internalize the rules of the situation, because everything I have just said requires a voice in your head, and they don't have that. The next comes from the first three, and that is.
Pessoal, eu tô morrendo de sono. É muito interessante, mas eu vou parar aqui, tá bom? E amanhã a gente continua, certo? Nesse mesmo horário. Tá bom? Valeu, boa noite, até amanhã.